Perfect, thank you. Okay, well, congratulations everyone in terms of sticking around until the end of the day. As Matthew mentioned, my name is Erin. I'm based here at QUT and I hold a number of hats. But before I kick off, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of which we're gathered today, the Turrbal and the Yagara peoples, and pay my respects to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits, and very much acknowledge that these lands have always been lands of teaching and research and learning. So I've been asked to talk today about IP commercialisation, and I thought I'd start from that really broad perspective. Just in terms of more of a deep tech environment at the moment, pretty much everything is tech at the moment. So it could be biotech. I learned very recently about something called death tech, which is everything tech associated with the end of life. So whether that is things in terms of wills or probate or grief guides or anything like that, apparently a very emerging industry. In terms of clean tech, everything tech, there is a lot of money going into it at the moment. And even in Australia as well, deep tech, I think, so these are all articles that were probably from about 6 months ago now, but deep tech is very much in the spotlight. And you might ask yourself, how does this relate then into health and IP? And so I would say in terms of all of the discussion that's happening around quantum and artificial intelligence and robotics, there are lots of applications that are going to go across the entire way that we help care for people, that we help treat people, and how we might be analysing their information as well. So apart from deep tech being in the headlines, we also generally have commercialisation in the headlines. Generally, they're not very positive discussions either. They're all about things like we could do better, when Australia as a country is perhaps not as great at it. I will argue, and hopefully I will give you some information in this presentation that maybe demonstrates that we're perhaps not good at selling the story of it versus the actual figures around it. And as our Senior Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research here at QUT has highlighted very recently, Australia perhaps needs to spend a bit more money on R&D broadly in order to have that broad pipeline that can start at that discovery stage and go all the way through. If we're not doing the blue sky inventive, I don't know what this is going to turn out like research, chances are we're not going to be able to find the next Wi-Fi or the next cochlear implant or anything like that. So in terms of where we are at the ecosystem, I think that there are lots of challenges, but with challenges, we always find opportunities. So let me start with how I might define IP commercialisation. So you can call this everything from research commercialisation, from tech transfer, knowledge transfer. In the UK, it's more knowledge exchange. And if I take a definition from a global society, so the Association of Technology Transfer Professionals, they describe it as a collaborative, creative endeavour that translates knowledge and research into impact in society and the economy. And the thing that I love about that definition is it's not all about making money, even though a lot of times when people talk about commercialisation, they're very much around, or they have the perception of the money side. For me, commercialisation is making research useful. So I can see that in broad applications across all of the areas of the university that I work across, and I can see that as a really broad, inclusive definition as well. Okay, and then I included this just mainly because I like this to describe my job sometimes. And so I will let you ponder around that, but sometimes this is where we sit as well. Okay, so in terms of commercialisation in Australia, so you might have been following that the Department of Education, Skills and Employment in February 2022 launched this thing called the University Research Commercialisation Action Plan. And so this was designed to provide a number of pillars around how the federal government at the time wanted to address research commercialisation. And one of the great things about ERCS, which is interesting that it is pronounced like that, is Australia's Economic Accelerator. So this is a program that has already launched, at least in a seed phase. They have had 2 rounds of this seed phase. And while it's $1.6 billion, that's over 10 years though. So these are still big numbers, but they're a stage-gated competitive grant program. So the idea is that it's very much focused around universities, working with industry and those outside of the universities to try and commercialise activities. So I think I have advocated for something like this for at least a decade, and it is fantastic when it actually comes through. So they're proof of concept grants. They're designed as fast fail, up from 3 to 12 months. And for these smaller ones, so the ones that go from TRL 3 to 5, which are currently called Ignite, you can get $500,000. And for Innovate, which hopefully will launch at some stage next year, so hopefully sooner rather than later, it's for any projects at TRL 5 to 7, and they are up to $5 million. So this is a fantastic pool of money. It is highly competitive. It's linked to Australia's National Reconstruction Fund priorities, but it's really designed to push things forward. So it's fantastic that Australia now has access to that kind of proof of concept funding. Another thing that came out of that University Research Commercialisation Action Plan were the University Trailblazers. So QUT is a part of the Food and Beverage Accelerator, so number 5 on that map, which is led through the University of Queensland. And so that for us is linking into our precision fermentation capability here at QUT, as well as some of our infrastructure facilities, so our Mackay pilot plant. And it's really designed to accelerate both innovative ingredients, so think of things that might go into new food or beverage products, so flavours or different proteins or different additives, as well as premium food and beverages. So think of things like, for instance, non-alcoholic beverages, or ways that you might be able to adjust and create non-dairy milks or non-meat meats, think V2 foods. So these are all around the country. There are 6 of them. And in terms of investment, it totals about 1.3 billion. So at least a third of that is federal government funding. So they invested over 300 million in this program. The other surprise around that is that it was announced by the coalition government on the lead up to the election. They went round to all of these sites and made lovely announcements. And when government changed, the Labor government that came in kept the promises of these. So in terms of a policy area, we can see that there was bipartisan support across that. And the next part is really around researcher workforce mobility. So trying to understand how researchers and how academics can move in between research organisations, industry, how they can link better and have this mobility. So through both the Australian Research Council as well as other different PhD schemes, we now have this kind of pyramid of funding that's available to try and drive people through that process. So all of these are great things. The other part of it, which is still more currently in discussion, which I could probably spend an entire, well, probably day talking about, and perhaps I just reflecting, there is a higher education research commercialisation intellectual property framework. And this is something that has an interesting story in terms of how it came about. It is currently a voluntary suite of documents. And those documents are currently under review because it's been 12 months since they've been announced. So happy to talk about that in the break. But what I thought might be interesting and something that Matthew and I discussed was around commercialisation outcomes. So trying to understand as a sector, particularly if we're comparing Australian institutions to international institutions, what does that mean? How do we measure this? How are we able to collect data and then compare ourselves to our international counterparts? And so therefore, another one of the hats that I wear is as a Director of Knowledge Commercialisation Australasia. So KCA is the peak body for people that do jobs like mine across Australia and New Zealand. So people that are in research commercialisation, tech transfer, knowledge exchange roles. We are a non-profit, entirely volunteer driven, and we since 2000 have launched Scopa. So how this came about was originally the Department of Industry here in Australia had a national survey of research commercialisation. This got tied up in an innovation metrics task force review in about 2017, and those results never quite filtered out. So there was this period of 2017, 18, 19 where no data was collected. So KCA as a board got together and decided that if we were going to talk about research commercialisation as a topic, if it was something that we were going to be compared to our international counterparts on, we needed to have the data. We couldn't just sit there without any sort of information around what performance was looking like. So we restarted in 2020 and we collected the previous 3 years of data, and we have collected it annually since. And as of this year, we have also been supported by the Australian government in that endeavour. So the Department of Education has come on board as a sponsor of that project. The data that I'm going to show you is from the summary report. You can download a copy of a fuller summary report from the website. And each of the individual institutions that submit that data are able to get a full data set from that as well. Okay, so what is SCOPA? So it's an activity of KCA, and it's really to try and provide that data that highlights the role of these research commercialisation professionals in assisting our researchers working together to try and get a commercial outcome. It collects these metrics from across both Australian and New Zealand universities, MRIs, any sort of publicly funded research organisation, and allows us to do that benchmarking. It is entirely voluntary. It is self-reported data. So on occasion, it might be that we receive, a particular piece of information from a particular respondent that looks a bit odd. We might go back to that participant and say, hey, are you sure? Is that a transposition error? In most cases, it's no, that is our information. That is what we would like to report. And the great thing about SCOPA is sometimes a couple of years afterwards, you actually then get the announcement that links to the data point that you saw back here. So one of the challenges around research commercialisation, particularly in terms of executing on some of these agreements, is they're often very confidential. And so a large pharmaceutical company might not want or might prohibit you to let anyone know how much they paid for something. It might be that there are general restrictions on companies that are being spun out because they might be, and we had one for a couple of years that was in a stealth mode. So as in, we didn't want to flag to people in the industry that we were doing this because we didn't necessarily have, protected registrable intellectual property around it. We had a great concept, we had some excellent data, but we weren't in a position to file on it because of the breadth of it. So flagging that you were doing it meant that everyone else would suddenly look in that same area. And large companies with lots more people and lots more money would potentially get there faster. So that's one of the challenges. Not everyone submits all the data, and I don't think we could ever make it mandatory to submit to every different question that we ask, because some of the agreements and some of the deals that people would enter into would restrict them from doing that. So therefore, that's why those are the caveats that I'm going to give you before I present some of this. It's self-reported, and it is voluntary, and it is up to the individual in terms of what they report. Having said that, it gives us this brilliant example of what's happening in the ecosystem. So it allows us to help inform decisions, and we have 6 years of data now, so it's a fantastic resource. Okay, so what does it tell us? So in terms of what it collects, we collect some normalising metrics at the start. So these are really basic things in terms of how much income, research income, the university or publicly funded research institution receives, how much they spend, so their expenditure on research, how many researchers are there in terms of FTE, and then how many commercialisation people are there in terms of FTE. So this allows us to then, be able to compare organisations that are vastly different otherwise. We then collect kind of these work outcomes, so things like invention disclosures. So every time a researcher comes to someone in my team and says, hey, I've got this cool idea, and we have a discussion about whether we think there might be something in there, we then log an invention disclosure that kind of says, here's the researcher, here's the bit, the description of what they're working on, here's what it might go towards. And all of these metrics are very internationally relevant. So these are not things that Australians decided were important. These are things that internationally other organisations track as well. We then collect information around patents in terms of filings, any sort of other IP assets. So these might be plant breeders' rights, these might be designs or trademarks or other things. And then we count how many times we've done a deal in terms of something that has a license, an option or an assignment, any of those kind of commercialisation deals. And then we get to the final section of data, which is around outcomes metrics. Now, these are not outcomes in terms of a product being launched in the marketplace, because all we can track is what we can control. So for us, our commercialisation outcomes are around revenue that we might receive back. We also count how many spin-outs and startups, first of all, ones that we create that year or ones that are still active, how much equity we have in those. And then we take a really broad metric around industry research contracts. And we use this a bit as a proxy of how much is industry engaging with Australian or New Zealand institutions at this point in time. For a university, it's a really easy metric because it's a slither of a Category 3 HETC funding. For other institutions, I'm assuming it's far more complicated than that. And this is kind of the minimum amount of information that we thought might be useful, because as well, it's a voluntary survey, it's self-reported, we need people to engage with it. So in 2022, voluntary, we had 53 respondents from Australia, 11 respondents from New Zealand. So probably the other point to note is that Australia, when it previously had the National Survey of Research Commercialisation that was run by the Department of Industry, all of that raw data was published. So most Australian institutions are really comfortable with the fact that that data has previously been published, could potentially be published again. It's a way that they can maybe, the transparency is not so much of an issue. For our New Zealand colleagues, they have never had this sort of survey. So it's taken us a few years to get to the point where universities are comfortable with submitting the data and then potentially having it in some way identifiable. I think last year we had maybe one university from New Zealand that published, and this year we've had 7. So we would expect that to continue to rise. I think the great thing is that sometimes they can also see when we present this that, hey, if I had submitted data, I would be up there. And I actually look really good and I'm doing great work. So sometimes kind of that FOMO works out well. Okay, so I have given 5 years of data here, but I've highlighted the 22, which is the most recent. And this just gives us an idea of normalising data. And basically what that's telling me at the moment is that in Australia, we've had a slight increase in all areas. So our expenditure is going up, how many researchers we have are going up, how many research commercialisation staff is going up. So we're all kind of going in the right direction. In New Zealand, it's been a really huge jump in terms of research staff. But the thing from my perspective that concerns me there is it's not equivalent around research commercialisation staff. So they've added, and also probably something to note, is that because we have had such a jump in New Zealand respondents, we've also picked up a bucket load more researchers, but not necessarily any increase in terms of expenditure. So they're really interesting numbers, and academically, I wouldn't want to do a quantitative piece around it. So I'm giving you some of my observations. In terms of our work outcomes, so the things that we do on a day-to-day basis, we can see that we've kind of plateaued a little bit in terms of 22. We can also see that in terms of how many deals we're getting out though, that has definitely increased, and it is it is continuing to rise, as you can see over the 5 years. From our New Zealand respondents, that's kind of dipping a little bit. So it could also be that around 2019, it almost looks as if there was a bit of a peak in terms of patent filings, in terms of deals that they were doing. And so I think there have been a lot of economic restrictions post-COVID for our New Zealand institutions, and I think they're really starting to see it, particularly in terms of commercialisation activity. And often you see this because it can sometimes be a more discretionary area for the university. It's not necessarily on the core pillar of teaching or research. So sometimes it can be more challenging when it's a fiscally constrained environment to be able to resource that appropriately. In terms of our outcomes, so this again is really, it's really interesting to me because we've got this slight increase in commercialisation revenue, and this will always be bumpy. But we've also got a real growth again in terms of how much research, how much contract research we're doing with industry. So every time I see a newspaper that says, Australian universities, or we're awful, we don't work with companies, it's all terrible. I always reflect on the fact that the amount of money these companies and also a lot of international companies are spending with Australian institutions really reinforces the value that we are providing. I would say that if people are not having a good experience there or getting value or getting the information and outcomes that they need, they probably would stop spending their money on that kind of R&D activity. So for me, this is really reassuring in terms of the fact that continues to rise. And the number of startups also continues to rise. So often, particularly in times of investment, so it's been a really tough investment environment recently. So a couple of years ago, there was lots of early stage capital that was kind of looking to find homes. More recently, that has definitely contracted, but we've still got quite a good pipeline of active spin-outs and startups. So I have a couple of highlight slides. So in terms of our Australian highlights, we generally have, one tech transfer, one research commercialisation person for every 143 researchers. So if you ever ask me why I'm running from one place to another, that's my metric. And for on average, each person that works in a role like mine generally averages about 3 deals, so 3 licenses, options or assignments a year, and about just over $1 million in terms of commercialization revenue. And this is obviously heavily skewed because often it's these big giant deals that are able to skew the rest of the environment. So a couple of years ago, I was fortunate enough to be able to report that WeHi had just done a partial buyout of their venetoclax deal. I think it was a $325 million payment. That will not happen every year, and that's okay. But over time, you can see that if you've got more pipeline, more great deals being done, you're more likely to have those sorts of successes. And the average value of an active startup or spin-out is just over $2 million, which isn't bad in terms of those really active early stage, probably going through a seed round or maybe a Series A. So I would say that it's a really good example of the current level of activity around research commercialisation in Australia. For our New Zealand colleagues, they have 1 tech transfer person for every 124 researchers, which is better than Australia, but not as good as the year before. So it looks like they really have started to become stretched in terms of the environment. They do just over a deal each and generally bring in about 2 million New Zealand each year. And the average value of startups or spin-outs out of New Zealand at the moment is about 850K. So a bit less than their Australian counterparts, but it could also be due to the bit of the smaller environment as well. So we will keep tracking that information. Okay, and so to wrap, so some key challenges. So from my perspective, probably the main key challenge is just that resourcing of research commercialization professionals. It's such a varied skill set, and it's not like you can go to uni and get a degree in it, or there's not generally a clear pathway. Generally, people who do roles like mine might have a technical background, so a PhD. They might have spent some time in industry. They might be, I think I've got maybe 4 patent attorneys within my team that have gone out, done that, decided it wasn't exactly the thing that they wanted to do, but they really loved engaging with researchers and understanding those different technical expertise. So skills shortages are definitely a challenge. And to be fair, I don't think I'm alone in that in terms of industry at the moment. Alignment of that senior executive, academic, investor, industry priorities. How do we get everyone on the same page that has all these different priorities and different things that they need to achieve? And very much at the moment, so my next thing is very much trying to encourage around the early stage proof of concept and early stage venture capital. There's lots of venture capital in the market, but a lot of it is very much focused towards, software as a service, kind of IT, techie, I'm going to exit this in 3 years and you're going to get 20 times. And unfortunately, deep tech or anything associated with, generally things that we do within university environments that then get out are really long. So you're looking at least, 8 to 10 to 15 years. I've been working with James Dell and the Banana Biotech team here at QUT, and that is based on 30 years of work, and we're just now at regulatory submission. So, it's not a quick fix. It's not going to turn over that quickly. So how to improve that? My recommendations. So third stream funding, very much diversity in early stage VC. So at the moment, there's a few big players in Australia. And so once you've got, it's almost like the duopoly. As soon as you've got a few big players with lots of cash, often it becomes, quite difficult to do things that are slightly different or slightly outside of the box. Very much encouraging recognition and reward for academic researchers. So trying to understand what motivates researchers and how we can align incentives there and getting our senior executive champions. And so for me, I would love more of, in the UK, they have the Higher Education Innovation Funding Scheme. I would love one of those. In New Zealand, they've got a pre-seed accelerator fund. In the UK at the moment, they are going gangbusters around getting early stage venture capital funds up and running. So this is Northern Gritstone. So think of those Northern English universities like Manchester and Liverpool. And so they have currently raised £312 million, and they're aiming for £500 million in terms of this early stage VC investment. Breakthrough Victoria has put $100 million in terms of early stage investment, trying to accelerate deep tech research projects into impact. Another UK example is Midlands Mine Forge. So they've raised, I think, just over £250 million. So these are the Midlands universities, think Birmingham, Loughborough. So we're not necessarily talking Cambridge or Oxford or London. Like, these are universities that we, as Australian institutions can very much, align and compare ourselves with. New Zealand also has a commercialisation partner network, and the UK has the Knowledge Exchange Concordant. So this concordant is more a set of principles that universities sign up to say, we have an IP policy, we recognise our academics, we like doing commercialisation because it creates impact. It's these really high-level statements. And so if I could get any pieces of these here, that is my goal. And so with that, I would like to thank you and I'll hand back to Matthew.